Thank you for joining me for Session 6 in the Lifeway study, the book of Job and Ecclesiastes. The title is Power Displayed, and the lesson summary statement is God's wisdom and power are unfathomable. And the text is Job 40, verses 1 through 14. This lesson reminded me that so much of teaching is not just a matter of science, that is, knowing various methods about how to approach and teach a lesson, but it's also a matter of art. It's knowing your class and being able to respond in the moment. And so sometimes when you're preparing a lesson and it's somewhat difficult, just remember that you're a member of that class and they're going to help you teach this lesson. I start the lesson with an idea that I got from the youth's book on Job and Ecclesiastes, the Leader's Guide. I have mentioned before that I'd recommend you take a copy of that. Sometimes you'll find their explanations clearer. Sometimes they'll have some creative ideas that you could modify or use. And one of those is the way I'm going to introduce the lesson. I'm just simply going to ask the class an obvious question. Do you have a cell phone? And almost everyone has a cell phone these days. And what do you use your cell phone for? And I'm sure you'll get some discussions about that. For me, this cell phone is basically me taking my office and my library wherever I go. There's no place that I go that I can't find a moment in which to do some research or to actually do some work on my sermon or a Sunday school lesson. It's just an amazing device to me. The wealth and knowledge of the world is just right there available in this little device. And people will have all kinds of fun things to say. We talked about how dependent we've become on it. You'll leave your home and you'll get down the road. Remember, you've forgotten your cell phone. You'll go back and get it. It's that important to us. And then after we've had a discussion on that, I'm going to ask them, well, how is your Bible like your cell phone? And then we'll discuss that. If we would take just a fraction of the time we spend on our cell phone, and your cell phone will probably tell you how much screen time you actually have. If we took a fraction of that and spent each day with the Bible would introduce us to the God of wisdom and power, and we would learn how unfathomable this God is. Well, this is what's going on in this occasion with this conversation between Job and God. Now, just to put the verse in its context and to give people a flow of how the book of Job goes, I've written this on the board. We know about the prologue. We had a lesson that dealt with that, where there was this discussion between God and Satan, and God gave Satan permission to bring so much tragedy into Job's life. And then after we know the context of why this is happening to Job, we have this dialogue or debate that he has with his three friends. And we know there are 3 cycles of debates he has with his friends. Their basic assumption is that if you sin, it's because of unrighteousness. They had no comprehension that if you suffer, it's because of unrighteousness. They had no comprehension that sometimes you suffer because of righteousness. And we know that that's the case with Job. And Job struggles in defending himself and his innocence. After the 3rd cycle, they're just exhausted and they don't have anything more to say. And Job speaks for 2 or 3 chapters about his innocence. After he's completed that, a 4th character comes on the scene, Elihu. And Elihu is again stating the same truth. If you're suffering, it's because of unrighteousness. But he comes at it in a different perspective. He talks about it having redeeming values to it. It purifies your character. It gives you insights about life, those kinds of things. And Job doesn't even answer Elihu when he finishes, and God doesn't answer Elihu. And some have believed that Elihu is, in a sense, introducing God when he speaks. Elihu says he speaks for God. He does not speak for God. And so God now speaks for himself. And there's two speeches that God gives to Job, and Job doesn't have much to say in response to God. The first is he takes him on a tour of the universe. He shows him the heavens, the stars, and say, were you there when I made those things? He takes him on a study of the weather, and he says, do you know where the wind comes from? Do you know how to lay out the path of lightning? And of course, Job doesn't know that. And then he moves to the study of the animals, but he doesn't deal with domestic animals. He deals with wild animals. Do you know how they're fed? Do you know how they come into existence? And it just exposes to Job just how little knowledge he truly had of just the physical world. And if he had so little knowledge of the physical world, then he must also have little knowledge of what's happening in the spiritual world and the moral world. And then God speaks again. And it follows after this conversation that we have here, where he picks up. And this time he's going to talk about two great creatures. Behemoth, which is a land animal, and some speculate he may be talking about a hippopotamus, or it may be just some mythical figure, but man has no control over this. And it's picturing the weakness of human beings. And then there's a sea creature called Leviathan. And again, human beings have no control over this creature, but God does. And what it shows is a contrast between human weakness and God's sovereignty and God's power. And so that brings us to where we're at. In the middle of that speech that God has given, as the conclusion of the first one and the beginning of the second one, you'll notice that the lesson points in this study are all question marks. For example, correct me, he asks Job. Secondly, you question my justice, he asks Job. And then last of all, can you save yourself, is the idea of that. So let's just take a moment to look through this and see how we can help our class come to understand what Job's saying in terms of us discovering that this God that we serve is a God of wisdom, a God of power, and that it's unthinkable. It's unimaginable. He says it's unfathomable. So first of all, in verses 1 to 5, correct me, God challenges Job to explain his credentials to correct God. And he leads Job to admit that he couldn't add anything more to what he's already said, that he doesn't have the credentials to correct God. Notice verse 1. The Lord answered Job. Now that's what Job's been asking for all this time, that he'd have a conversation with God and that God would explain himself. Well, here we go. The Lord answered Job. Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who argues with God give an answer. Then Job answered the Lord, I am so insignificant. How can I answer you? I place my hand over my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not reply twice, but now I can add nothing. Now, in this passage of Scripture, you will notice this word contend. Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? The word contend means could refer to physical or verbal combat, particularly in a legal sense. And so he's claiming that God's not treating him fairly. And so he's arguing with God. He's debating with God. He's asserting, you are not right. You're not being just with me. And so God asks, will the one who contends with me, who argues with me, who debates me, who makes the claim that I'm not being justice with the Almighty, will he be the one who corrects the Almighty? That word Almighty is the word Shaddai, which you may be familiar with, and it's an emphasis on God's self-sufficiency and on God's omnipotence. And maybe Job was asserting that he was as capable as God in determining what was fair and just. And so when God speaks to him, the word that he uses to refer to himself is a word of self-sufficiency and omnipotence. Job, you're not contributing anything to me. Now, earlier Job had requested to have an argument with God, to have a conversation with God. You'll see that in chapter 9, verses 1 to 3, verse 14 and verse 20, and chapter 23, verses 1 to 5, and chapter 31, verse 35 to 37. And so God asks him, I want you to answer me about how I've been acting wrongly. And then in verse 3, then Job answered the Lord. And you'll notice that the word that is being used here is the word Yahweh, because we know that because the word Lord has all capital letters. And so this is the eternal God, the God who creates miracles, the God who creates. This is the God he's speaking with. Then Job answered Yahweh, I am so insignificant. Now Job's going to admit to two realities. The first is the vast difference between him and God. The word insignificant is a word in Hebrew. The verb of it means something that's very small in every way. Physically small. He's the grain of sand. Mentally, he's so very insignificant, very small in comparison to God. When it comes to power, there's just no contest there. And particularly in contrast to God, he is very small. In God's presence, he was unworthy to answer God's speech or present any case for his own righteousness. He's admitting, I'm very small. The second reality is in verse 5. I have spoken once, and I will not reply, twice, but now I can add nothing. He's saying there is nothing I can add to my previous assertions. And really, in one sense, what he is saying is I've already said too much. And his previous arguments miss the point. One of the books that I found helpful in finding commentary is something I'm sure you're getting, and it's the commentary on Explore the Bible. And I found this particular study to be very helpful in understanding the text. And I would encourage you to have that piece of supportive material as well. So how do we get into this with our class after going through these verses? I'm wanting to ask the class, what is the difference between contending with God, which is what Job was doing, and asking honest questions? Because the scriptures are very clear that God is not offended. He is not threatened in the least for us to ask questions. But Job had crossed the line in the sense of this contentious spirit with God, this arguing, this debating, this asserting that he was right and that God was doing something wrong. So what's the difference between contention and honest questions? And maybe one of the ways to get at that is, how would you contrast the way Job related to God in this experience of suffering and the way Jesus related to God as he faced the cross and even on the cross? So maybe that would help in getting at these passages and in understanding them. You're going to correct me. The second point is question my justice. Verses 6 to 9 of Job 40. And God does something very interesting here. Instead of defending himself point by point, for Job has made these accusations against God, and it's kind of a courtroom scene. And instead of just taking each of those points and then answering them and saying, this is the answer to that, what he does is he basically says, why don't you have a go at being the judge of the earth? So he says in verse 6, then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind, get ready to answer me like a man. When I question you, you will inform me. Would you really challenge my justice? Would you declare me guilty to justify yourself? Do you have an arm like God's? Can you thunder with a voice like His? Now, just a few explanations of the verses that may be of help to you when you're talking with your class. I mentioned the word Lord again, and that is an emphasis on God's eternal presence and His ability to create something out of nothing. So that's the one who, then the Lord answered Job from a whirlwind. This word whirlwind is different from the word whirlwind in chapter 1, verse 9. That was a destructive wind that destroyed the house that his children lived in. But in the scriptures, a storm is often a way in which God executes his judgment and towards people. There's something about it that shows God's displeasure. And so Job is before this God of greatness, and God is not pleased with him. It says in verse 7, "Get ready to answer me like a man." And your commentary will talk to you about the fact that it talks about girding up. The men in that day wore a tunic, and so when they went to work, or they went to run, or they went into battle or to fight, they would reach down and gather up that tunic and pull it up between their legs, and then they had a big thick leather belt, and they would stuff it down inside that belt, and it freed their legs either to work or to run or to fight if that was what was necessary. And so it came to have the idea of prepare yourself. So God is saying, you've been wanting this meeting, so prepare yourself and get ready to answer me like a man. Very interesting word. The word man there is not the general word for a man. It's a word that is used to describe an elite warrior. It's a word that's used to describe a man at his peak in terms of his virility and his strength and his capabilities. And so what he's saying is, get ready to answer me, and you need to be ready with your very best answers. When I question you, you will inform me. You're going to answer me now. And he goes on in verse 8, would you really challenge my justice? Would you declare me guilty to justify yourself? Will you declare God guilty in order to justify yourself? That's a good question. It discloses Job's spiritual arrogance. No one is better at running the universe than God. In verse 9, do you have an arm like God's? And we've talked about that the arm and the hand are the instruments of God's strength. They represent putting into action what your thoughts are. I mentioned in a previous lesson that a sculpture has an idea of what this piece of wood or stone or clay is to look like, and it's his hands and his arms that have the power to make that thought come into existence. And so he's talking here about the strength of God to implement his actions. Can you do that? Can you thunder with a voice like his? Thunder can shake a house, and it makes you aware of its presence. And so he's speaking here about his awesome presence and power. I asked the class, when your children were small, or your grandchildren, when you raised your voice to them, what was it that you were doing? What did you want to accomplish? And what I was looking for is you're wanting them to obey. They said, well, we want them to listen. And I asked, well, listen for what purpose? Well, for them to do what I'm asked them to do. And so here we have God raising his voice to Job. Now, how would Job have responded differently if he would have had this perspective of God? How would he have responded differently if he had our perspective of God instead of his limited perspective at that time? What would he have said about God's wisdom and power in the midst of this suffering? And I'm hoping what I can pull out of the class is that because of our understanding of God, instead of being so contentious with God, we recognize that though we don't understand, he understands. And though we feel powerless, he's not powerless. And so the proper response is to trust God and obey as best we understand at that moment. Can question my justice. The third point is save yourself. chapter 40, verses 10 through 14. Now, only God has the wisdom and the power to rule His creation. And what He does here, He challenges Job to do things that only God can do effectively. And the way He does, He's daring Job to do a better job. And what He does is He pictures the splendor of the clothing of a king. Now, the king wore the most beautiful clothing in the land, and his clothing identified him as the great person of the land. When you're studying the Exodus, they'll have a lengthy description about the high priest's clothing. And every part of it has significance. But it was beautiful. There was no one in the land who dressed as beautifully as the high priest. And the reason was to draw attention to the significance of the role of the high priest. So he describes a king with his beautiful clothing, and it is to elevate the significance, the power, the greatness, the unfathomableness of God. Now notice how he puts it in verse 10. Adorn yourself with majesty and splendor, and clothe yourself with honor and glory. Pour out your raging anger. Look on every proud person and humiliate him. Look on every proud person and humble him. Trample the wicked where they stand. Hide them together in the dust. Imprison them in the grave. Then I will confess to you that your own right hand can deliver you. He's basically challenging him. Can you do the things that God can do? So this first picture, adorn yourself with majesty. The verb means to rise, and it points to the exaltation that's produced by God when He is victorious over His enemies. Majesty. Think about the Red Sea. No God can do that. He splits a sea. He dries up the bottom. 1 million, 2 million people go across. The enemy chariots come into the bottom of that sea. He closes the sea on top of them, and the great army of the Egyptians is completely destroyed. Their bodies, their animals, their chariots are washing up on the shore of the Red Sea, and the Israelites are on the other side. What kind of a God is this? This is the idea of majesty. He rises. He's exalted in the power of His victories. And then he talks about the fact that He is a God of splendor. It's talking about lofty eminence. When you see a king all adorned in his greatness, it says he stands higher. He's more powerful. He has more authority. He has greatness in comparison to the peasant and the commoner. We have hills in Oklahoma. We don't have mountains. We have one mountain that's about 5 foot short of qualifying for a mountain. But to Oklahomans, they look like mountains. Then we go to the Rockies in Colorado, and they're mountains. And those mountains put our hills in perspective. We have canyons in Oklahoma. We have some deep canyons in Oklahoma. We have some beautiful canyons in Oklahoma. And then you go to the Grand Canyon. And then you recognize what is truly a grand canyon. Their splendor puts other things in its proper place. You have an athlete in high school. He's a good athlete. He's the best athlete in the high school. And then you tune into the Olympics and you see what those athletes can do. And you recognize that in calling this young man or young woman a great athlete, that's a relative term. Those are great athletes. This is what he's using by this word splendor. The splendor of God puts things in their proper place. He goes and says, clothe yourself with honor and glory. Again, honor is the idea of respect. Glory is the idea of an impressive opinion. That one of the words for glory means, it comes from the root word opinion. When you leave a church service and you say, that was a glorious service. What do you mean by that? you mean that service lifted your opinion of God. Maybe it was His love or His holiness or His mercy or His forgiveness. But you leave that service and you have a higher opinion of God. This is what He says. He says, adorn yourself with majesty, with splendor. Clothe yourself with honor and with glory. The other thing that God can do is pour out your raging anger. Look on every proud person and humiliate him. Look on every proud person and humble him. Trample the wicked where they stand. It's talking about He can bring to judgment the wicked. Can you find that? Notice He says in verse 12, look on every proud person. He has the capabilities of looking the whole world over and finding the unjust persons, and He has the ability to see the individuals as well. And He has the ability to bring them to judgment. Job, do you have that capabilities? Notice in verse 13, hide them together in the dust, imprison them in the grave. The word hide means it can't be found. That's what the idea is in the Hebrew. And then when you couple that with this word imprison, it speaks of permanence in God's judgment. In other words, Job, can you exercise judgment on the wicked, and that judgment can't be overturned? We're hearing in the news oftentimes about people who were sentenced, and rightly so, and then some detail is left out, and then they're released. Their judgment is set aside. But He's asking Job, can you judge and the judgment's not set aside? He goes on in verse 14, then I will confess to you that your own right hand can deliver you. If you can do that, then I'll say that you have the power and authority to deliver yourself. After this explanation, I asked the class, how did you come to experience how dependent you were on God? How did you come to recognize, for example, in your salvation, that you needed God? You could not save yourself. And that elicited some responses. I prompted that by telling them something about myself. In high school, I recognized my need to change. So I read Dale Carnegie's book on how to win friends and influence people and how to stop worrying and start living. I read a book called Psycho-Cybernetics, and I just couldn't change. I even asked a friend, I said, when I use a profanity, I'll pay you so much money. And that guy's rich now. But anyway, I just never was able to break that. And later on, in college, my wife and I married, and with our struggles in our marriage, it led me to the Scriptures and it led me to church. And through my reading of the Scriptures and attending church, I came to an understanding of my need for Jesus Christ. And that's when things began to change for me. And maybe your class members will have other kinds of stories like that. Save yourself? No, you need a Savior. Now, the way I closed it is, how should we approach God when we're feeling a sense of injustice, that this is not right? And then again, I take them back to Jesus. When you look at Jesus, how did Jesus respond when He was facing suffering? And some of the answers was, well, He prayed. He had a perspective that God was good and wise, and he trusted God's wisdom and power. And so that was the way we began to close the lesson. I had one assignment for them. I asked them, this week in your prayers, would you focus more upon celebrating the character of God, His wisdom and His power? God bless you, friend. Thank you for watching and participating.